Ethan Caldwell's mansion was more than just a home. It was an empire of power and silence. At 35, he ruled the world with an overwhelming presence, feared by anyone who crossed his path. But nothing could prepare him for Mia, a simple young woman who came to work at the mansion and, without meaning to, challenged everything he knew. She wasn't intimidated, didn't bow before his wild gaze. Something in his lonely heart was touched. But what would really happen when these two worlds collided? He, an unbeatable lion. She, the only one who stood toe-to-toe with him. But what happened next? No one could have imagined. If this story touched you, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments, where are you listening to this message from? Your support is what keeps this channel alive. Ethan Caldwell wasn't just a man. He was an empire in motion. At 35, he had already built more wealth than most could even dream of in a lifetime. A tech mogul, investor, and businessman, his name was synonymous with power and success. His mansion, hidden deep in the heart of Georgia, stood as a massive structure, luxurious, elegant, yet cold. It mirrored Ethan's own personality, sleek on the outside but empty within. Surrounded by opulence, rare art, expensive wines, and a car collection that would make any enthusiast envious, there was still a hollowness inside him, a void no amount of money or control could fill. Known as the Lion, not just because of his surname, but for the aura that surrounded him, Ethan commanded respect wherever he went. His presence was magnetic, demanding the attention of everyone around him, and he was aware of it. His power was both admired and feared. He ruled his vast estate with an iron fist, ensuring that no one dared question his authority. In his world there were no equals, only him, the untouchable, the king of his domain. People in his life never dared to challenge him. His employees knew their place, speaking only when spoken to, and his business partners carefully chose their words around him. Ethan's life was meticulously controlled, every move calculated to ensure he stayed at the top. In the hushed halls of his mansion, it seemed as though even time held its breath, waiting for his next command. Despite his power, Ethan had always felt that something was missing. His heart, though carefully guarded, longed for something he couldn't name. Part of him craved connection, but he had buried it deep inside, convincing himself that such desires were weaknesses, something for ordinary people, not a man like him. It was on one of those quiet afternoons, as the sun sank beneath the trees and cast long shadows across the estate, that Mia arrived. She was unlike any woman Ethan had known, polished, delicate, and draped in the finest fabrics money could buy. Mia had none of that. She was young with a simplicity that immediately struck Ethan. Her clothes were modest, and while her features were soft and delicate, there was a fire in her eyes that commanded attention. When she first stepped into his world, Ethan felt something he had never experienced before: intrigue. Mia had come to work as a housekeeper, tasked with the most menial of chores, yet when she entered his mansion, she carried herself as if she had every right to be there. Her presence seemed to shift the very atmosphere. The house, which had always felt cold and unwelcoming to him, suddenly felt warmer. Though she treated him with the same respect as everyone else, there was something different about her. Mia didn't cower in his presence. She didn't fear the man who ruled the estate, and that was something Ethan wasn't prepared for. At first, he watched her from a distance, captivated by the way she moved through the halls, her confidence unshaken by the grandeur that surrounded her. She didn't look up at him with awe, nor did she seem intimidated by his imposing figure. She simply did her job, steady and focused as though she belonged, and in a strange way it unsettled him. Ethan, who had always been in control, found himself drawn to her in ways he couldn't explain. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt the walls around his heart beginning to crack. Mia was different from all the women he had known. She wasn't after his money or status. She didn't come with expectations or hidden agendas. There was no ulterior motive. It was as though she saw through him, to the man beneath the empire. Every time she spoke, her voice was steady, free of the usual nervous tremor that others had around him. She didn't flatter him or seek his approval, and that intrigued him even more. How could someone so unremarkable in society's eyes affect him so deeply? She wasn't trying to win him over, yet there was something about her he couldn't shake. A quiet challenge seemed to linger whenever they were in the same room. Ethan didn't understand what was happening to him. He, the king of his domain, was used to being the one in control, the one holding all the power. But Mia didn't bow to him. She didn't even seem to notice the authority he wielded. She was unaffected by his wealth, his name, or his position, and that only made him want her more. It was as if she were a puzzle he couldn't solve, a mystery he desperately wanted to uncover. He began to observe her in secret, when she walked through the halls, when she worked in the kitchen, when she spoke with the other staff. He watched her every move, the way she carried herself, the quiet confidence she exuded. Every detail about her seemed to captivate him, but the more he watched, the more frustrated he became. She wasn't doing anything extraordinary, she was just being herself. But that was precisely what fascinated him. In a world where everyone was constantly trying to impress him, Mia didn't try at all, and that made her stand out in ways Ethan couldn't comprehend. As days passed, the tension between them grew. It was unspoken but tangible. Ethan, who had always prided himself on his ability to control his emotions, was slowly losing his grip. He could feel the familiar walls of detachment crumbling every time he saw her. It was an unsettling sensation, one that both terrified and thrilled him. He had built his life on control, on dominance, on power. And now here she was, a woman who seemed to possess none of those qualities, yet had somehow taken control of his thoughts, his desires, his world. Mia, for her part, remained unaware of the effect she had on him. She didn't look at him the way others did, with longing, admiration, or fear. She simply saw him as a man, no different than any other. She wasn't intimidated by him, nor was she eager to please him. She just did her job, never once acknowledging the silent battle unfolding within Ethan. Yet in those quiet moments when their eyes met, there was something electric in the air. It was brief, a flicker, but enough to make Ethan's heart race. He couldn't help but wonder if Mia felt it too. The lion, used to being the predator, was starting to feel the unfamiliar sting of vulnerability. And for the first time, he didn't know if he was the one in control anymore. Something had shifted. And though he wasn't sure where this journey would lead, he knew that Mia was the key to unlocking the mystery that had haunted him for so long. As the days passed, Ethan could no longer deny the attraction he felt toward her. But with it came an unsettling realization. He wasn't just attracted to her, he was starting to care for her, and that, more than anything, terrified him. Could a man like him ever let down his guard enough to let someone else into his world? Could he trust her? Or would she, like everyone else, eventually disappoint him? Mia's arrival in his life wasn't just a disruption, it was the beginning of something Ethan couldn't control, something far beyond the reach of his empire. But what would happen next? Would Mia be the one to tame the lion, or would she too be consumed by the flames of his past? The air in the mansion seemed to crackle with unspoken tension every time Mia entered a room. It wasn't that she tried to make an impact, but her presence had an undeniable weight to it, one that Ethan could not ignore. At first, it was subtle, like a soft shift in the atmosphere, but soon it became something undeniable. The elegant walls of his home, which had once seemed so invincible, now felt vulnerable under the steady gaze of Mia. She didn't fawn over him or shy away from his imposing figure. Instead, she simply existed, her confidence speaking louder than any words ever could. Ethan had spent his entire life surrounded by women who were eager to please him. Beautiful women, sophisticated and carefully curated to meet his every expectation. They were mirrors of his success, polished, perfect, and dutifully submissive. They knew their place in his world, and he knew his place in theirs. They were a reflection of his empire, beautiful on the outside, but hollow within. But Mia, with her unassuming demeanor and unbending gaze, was nothing like the women he knew. She didn't care to impress him. She didn't care about his power, his wealth, or his name. For the first time in Ethan's life, a woman wasn't interested in what he could give her. She simply wanted to be who she was, unaffected by the trappings of his world. This realization hit him like a gust of cold air in the dead of summer. His usual confidence faltered under the weight of it. She moved through the house like someone who belonged there, though she came from a life far removed from the luxury of his own. Mia was no more interested in the grandiosity of the mansion than she was in the man who owned it. There was something refreshing in that, something raw and authentic that Ethan found both unnerving and exhilarating. And yet, as she walked past him, a small part of him couldn't help but watch her. It wasn't just her physical presence that caught his attention, though she was undeniably beautiful in her own way. It was the way she carried herself, her quiet strength, her ability to hold her ground without saying a word. Unlike the women who had been hand-picked to please him, Mia didn't shy away from meeting his gaze. If anything, she stared at him with a kind of silent defiance, as if daring him to do something about it. It unsettled him. It stirred something deep inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. Ethan had never been challenged like this. He wasn't used to feeling like he was the one who needed to adjust. In his world, women bent to his will, not the other way around. But Mia, with her steady gaze and quiet presence, made him feel like he was the one who had to prove something. He had to admit it to himself. She was different, and that difference intrigued him in a way he couldn't explain. As the days passed, he found himself thinking about her more and more. It wasn't just physical attraction, it was something deeper, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He would catch himself looking for her as she passed by the grand staircase or in the hallways, his thoughts lingering on her longer than they should. It was like a pull he couldn't resist, a magnetic force drawing him to her, even though he tried to ignore it. He was disturbed by how easily she invaded his thoughts. Ethan had never been a man who allowed anything to disrupt his focus. Yet here was Mia, slipping under his skin, occupying his mind in a way no one else had ever done. It felt strange, almost juvenile, to be this preoccupied by someone, and it unnerved him. He tried to push the thoughts away, telling himself that she was just another employee, just another person in the background of his perfectly curated life. But the more he told himself to forget her, the more impossible it became. It wasn't just that she didn't try to please him. She didn't seem to want anything from him. Mia wasn't interested in flattering him, and that alone made her stand out from the rest. She wasn't a woman who clung to the hope of gaining something from her proximity to him. She simply was, and that was both disarming and liberating. For the first time, Ethan realized that there was a person in his life who saw him not as the powerful man he was, but simply as someone who existed in the same space as her. And that made him want to know her more, despite the fact that he knew he shouldn't. One evening, he found himself walking through the grand hallway, the faint sound of her voice coming from the kitchen as she worked. He hadn't intended to be there, hadn't planned on crossing her path, but somehow, his feet led him to the space where she was. As he neared, he could feel his heart rate quicken. What was this feeling? It wasn't just curiosity. It was something deeper. He wasn't sure if it was desire, frustration, or just pure fascination, but he couldn't ignore it. She was standing by the counter, her back to him as she prepared the evening meal. The simple act of her cutting vegetables, her hands moving with practiced ease, seemed to draw him in. His eyes followed the fluid motions of her fingers, the way she tilted her head slightly as she concentrated on the task at hand. And then she turned slightly, catching his gaze for just a moment. It was brief, too brief, but it was enough to send a shock of awareness through him. She didn't look away immediately. Instead, she held his gaze, her expression calm, her eyes steady. There was no fear in them, no hesitation. It was as if she was waiting for him to make the first move. Ethan felt something stir within him, something he couldn't control. It was the first time in a long time that he had felt this kind of vulnerability. She had made him feel unsure. She wasn't intimidated by him, nor was she impressed. She simply stood her ground as though she didn't need to be anything other than what she was. As he stood there watching her, the realization hit him harder than he expected. He was not the one in control. For the first time in his life, he was the one who was being challenged, the one who was unsure of himself. And the worst part? He didn't know if he wanted to fight it. Mia was a riddle he couldn't solve, a puzzle that both frustrated and fascinated him. The more he tried to resist, the more drawn to her he became. And in that moment, as the tension between them simmered in the quiet of the kitchen, Ethan felt a spark ignite within him. It was the beginning of something he hadn't expected, something that was about to change everything. What would happen next? Would he finally confront the emotions that Mia had stirred within him, or would he retreat further into his fortress, pushing her away before she had the chance to get too close? It started as an innocent observation, a fleeting glance here and there, a momentary distraction as Ethan went about his day. But over time it became something more, a pull he couldn't resist. Ethan Caldwell, the man who had conquered industries and commanded respect, now found himself watching Mia with an intensity that bordered on obsession. It wasn't just her beauty that caught his eye, though she was undeniably striking in her own way. It was the way she moved, the way she existed in his world. Every little detail seemed to captivate him. The way her hair fell around her face when she bent down to pick something up, the rhythm of her steps as she moved through the house, the soft rustle of her clothes as she worked. There was something about her presence that made the world feel quieter, more focused. Every time she crossed his path, his senses heightened. The smell of her, faint yet intoxicating, lingered in the air long after she had passed. It wasn't a fragrance he could place, just a scent that reminded him of fresh rain and earth after a long drought. It was grounding, soothing, and it made him ache for something he couldn't define. Her voice was another thing, soft, steady, unhurried. It carried a sense of calm that Ethan couldn't ignore. When she spoke, it wasn't with the pleasantries or forced charm that others used around him. Mia's words were simple, direct, with no hidden agenda. She didn't speak to impress. She spoke because she had something to say, and that authenticity was a rarity in Ethan's world. The more he heard her, the more he found himself wanting to hear her speak, even if it was just about something mundane. The control that Ethan had always prided himself on began to slip like sand through his fingers. For the first time, his mind was not consumed by the next business deal or the power he held over others. Instead, it was consumed by thoughts of Mia, her smile, her laughter, the way her eyes would catch his, almost as if she could see through him. It wasn't just attraction, it was an ache, a yearning, a desire for something he couldn't quite place, but couldn't escape either. He told himself it was just a passing infatuation, that it would fade. After all, he was a man used to getting what he wanted. And Mia, she was just another employee, someone who was beneath him in every way. But the more he tried to dismiss it, the more it consumed him. Mia wasn't like the women he had known before. She didn't flirt with him, didn't throw herself at him with the same desperate hope that others had. She wasn't trying to win him over. In fact, she seemed completely unaffected by him. And that, more than anything, drove him wild. Her indifference to his power, his wealth, and even his status only made her more alluring. Every time their paths crossed, it was as if she was holding a mirror to him, reflecting all of the things he didn't want to see. She didn't care about the empire he had built, and that bothered him more than he cared to admit. Ethan had never been afraid of anything. Fear was something for the weak, something that didn't have a place in his world. But now, with every passing day, a new kind of fear was beginning to take root inside him. He was afraid of wanting something he couldn't control. For years, Ethan had carefully cultivated his life, shaping every aspect of it to fit his desires. He controlled the world around him with precision, bending people and circumstances to his will. But Mia? Mia was different. She didn't fall at his feet, didn't try to charm him. She didn't care about his money or his power. She simply existed, and that drove him to the edge of madness. He started to watch her more closely, his gaze lingering just a little too long whenever she entered a room. He couldn't help himself. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was something deeper. He was starting to lose himself in the idea of her. He would catch himself thinking about her during meetings, imagining the way she would look if she were in his arms, if she allowed him to touch her the way he longed to. At night, when the house was silent and the lights dimmed, Ethan would lie awake in bed, his mind racing. He would replay the moments he'd shared with her, the brief exchanges, the fleeting glances, the way she moved when she wasn't aware of his watchful eyes. He would imagine her standing beside him, her body pressed against his, her breath on his skin. The thought of it made him ache in a way he hadn't experienced in years. It was dangerous, he knew. The more he thought about her, the more he felt himself slipping into something he couldn't control. He was a man used to mastering everything in his life. his business, his reputation, his desires. But Mia? She was slipping through his fingers, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to stop it. Ethan had always believed that pleasure was the ultimate form of control. He could indulge in anything he wanted, whenever he wanted, without consequence. But now, with Mia, it was different. It wasn't just about the physical pull he felt toward her. It was the way she made him question everything he thought he knew about himself. She was the one person who didn't seek anything from him, and that, more than anything, made him want her more. The desire wasn't just physical, it was emotional, psychological, and now it had become an obsession. Ethan had always prided himself on his ability to stay focused, to keep his instincts in check, but Mia was chipping away at that, little by little. She was disrupting the calm he had carefully constructed in his life, making him feel things he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. What was it about her that did this to him? What was it that made him feel so out of control, so vulnerable? He couldn't understand it, but he didn't want to fight it anymore. He wanted more. He wanted to know her, to possess her, not just in the physical sense, but in every way that mattered. He wanted to pull her into his world, to make her a part of it, even if it meant giving up the control he had held for so long. The more he allowed himself to indulge in these thoughts, the more he found himself craving her. His need for her grew, expanding with each passing day until it became an obsession. And as much as he tried to deny it, Ethan knew that he was losing himself in a desire that he couldn't control, a desire that scared him more than anything else in his life. What would he do when his obsession reached its peak? Would he finally confront Mia, admit what he was feeling, or would he retreat further into himself, afraid of the vulnerability that came with wanting her? The answer seemed just beyond his reach, but Ethan knew one thing for sure: whatever happened next, his life would never be the same. The mansion had a way of quieting the world around it. The long high ceilings in the great hall swallowed sound, and the heavy drapes over the windows seemed to keep even the outside world at bay. Inside, it was always cool, with the distant hum of the air conditioning barely noticeable unless you focused on it. But in the library, it was different. The tall shelves lined with old books, the smell of leather and parchment, the soft glow from the desk lamp. This room was a place of quiet, introspective solitude. Ethan often found peace in here, surrounded by stories of the past, by characters and histories that he could control, that would never challenge him. But today, the room was charged with something different, something he couldn't control. He had caught sight of Mia as she moved between the aisles, shelving books with that quiet grace of hers. He hadn't intended to confront her today, but something about the way she walked through his domain with such unbothered ease stirred something in him. She wasn't intimidated by him, not by his wealth, not by his reputation, not by the shadows that loomed over his every move. And that had become an obsession in itself. How could a woman like her, someone who came from so little, who didn't even belong in this world, look at him with those steady eyes and not shrink back? For the past few weeks, Ethan had been struggling with this feeling, this pull towards her. Every time they crossed paths, every time he found himself looking at her with an intensity he couldn't quite explain, he felt as if the ground beneath him was shifting. He wasn't used to feeling this way. He wasn't used to being the one who had to adapt, the one who had to change his behavior to accommodate someone else. But Mia was different. She wasn't like the others who fawned over him, who bent to his will. And it made him feel as though he was losing something vital, something he couldn't get back. She was at the back of the library when he entered, lost in her task, oblivious to his approach. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension. He had watched her for a few moments from the doorway, noting the way she moved, the way she seemed so absorbed in her work. Everything about her was a contrast to the world he lived in. The luxury, the control, the polished masks he wore, all of it seemed meaningless in her presence, and it made him angry, in a way he couldn't explain. Without thinking, Ethan walked into the room, his footsteps firm, echoing against the quiet walls. His presence was enough to make her pause, to turn slightly and glance up at him, her brow slightly furrowed. She didn't flinch when their eyes met. She didn't look away or lower her gaze. She just stood there, calm, like the steady center of a storm. "Why don't you fear me?" Ethan asked, his voice quiet but edged with something sharper, something like a challenge. Mia blinked, surprised by the question, but there was no hesitation in her response. She had never been a woman to cower, and this moment was no different. She met his gaze head-on, her expression steady, her voice clear. "I didn't come here to fear anyone. I came here to work." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the stomach. He hadn't expected such a direct answer, hadn't expected her to be so blunt, so unaffected by the weight of his question. But what struck him even more was the underlying truth in her response. She wasn't afraid of him because, in her mind, he didn't deserve that kind of power over her. She had a purpose, a life that didn't revolve around him, and it unnerved him. In that instant, he understood something he hadn't fully grasped before. He wasn't the one in control here. He had always prided himself on being the lion, the one who commanded attention, the one who dictated the rules. But Mia wasn't interested in the game. She wasn't interested in his power or his wealth. She didn't care about the fact that he was Ethan Caldwell, the man who had everything. She simply saw him as a man, one who had to earn her respect, not demand it. For a fleeting moment, Ethan felt a flicker of something within him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: vulnerability, and it terrified him. His entire life had been built on controlling his emotions, on maintaining that cold, impervious exterior. But with Mia, all of that was slipping away. There was something in her that made him want to be a better man, something that challenged every instinct he had. But what he hadn't realized until this moment was that he couldn't just control her like he had with everyone else in his life. She wasn't like the others. And if he truly wanted her, if he truly wanted to break through the walls she had built, he would have to do something he had never done before. He would have to surrender. Ethan stood there for a long moment, staring at her, feeling the walls he had so carefully constructed around himself begin to crumble. He wanted to fight it, wanted to push her away, to keep her at arm's length. But something in the way she looked at him, calm, unafraid, made him realize that if he didn't lower his guard, he would lose her. And for the first time in his life, he didn't want to lose something. There was no bravado, no calculated move. He simply exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly as the weight of her words sank in. He had built his empire by never showing weakness, by never letting anyone get too close. But Mia? She was forcing him to confront parts of himself he had long buried, parts of him that craved something real, something raw. "I didn't expect that answer," he said quietly, his voice softer now. The arrogance he usually carried with him seemed to dissipate as he spoke. "You're right. I've spent my life controlling everything around me, but I've never had to try to control someone like you." Mia said nothing, simply watching him with those steady eyes. She didn't gloat or say anything to provoke him further. She didn't need to. Her silence was enough. It was a silence that spoke volumes, that made Ethan realize that if he wanted to win her over, if he wanted to truly connect with her, he would have to let go of everything that made him feel powerful. He would have to surrender to show her that he wasn't the untouchable lion anymore. He was just a man. "I won't try to control you," he said, his voice sincere, for once devoid of the sharp edge it usually held. "But I will try to understand you, and I'll respect your space, your boundaries, your strength." Mia nodded slowly, accepting his words, though she didn't speak. But in that moment, Ethan felt a shift between them, something that had never been there before. It wasn't domination. It wasn't a game of power. It was something much more human, something real. For the first time in his life, Ethan Caldwell had lowered his weapons. And in doing so, he realized he had given himself a chance at something he hadn't even known he was seeking: true connection. It was the smallest of moments, the kind that could easily be overlooked. Yet for Ethan and Mia, it would mark the turning point of everything. A subtle shift in the air, an unspoken invitation that neither could resist. It had been a long day, and as the evening settled in, the mansion seemed to grow quieter, more intimate. The usual noise of the world outside was muffled by the thick walls, leaving only the soft hum of the house's old systems and the occasional rustling of the wind outside. In the corner of the library, where Ethan had spent countless hours lost in his thoughts, Mia had entered, her presence as steady and unassuming as ever. She had been delivering some books, her task as simple as it always was. But something about this particular evening felt different. Ethan had been watching her from the doorway again, the quiet intensity that had begun to define his thoughts growing stronger. This time, however, he didn't turn away. He didn't retreat into his mind. He simply stood there, eyes following her every move, the weight of his desire palpable in the space between them. She didn't seem to notice him at first, absorbed in her task, her back to him as she placed a stack of books on a nearby shelf. But then, just as if she could feel his gaze, she turned. And for a brief moment, time seemed to stretch, to hang in the air like a delicate thread between them. Her eyes met his, steady and unwavering, as though they had been here before, even though they hadn't. There was no need for words in that moment. They both understood without speaking that something was different now. It wasn't just the tension that had been building between them. It wasn't just the pull that had slowly become something they could no longer ignore. It was the fact that, in this space, this moment, they were both equally vulnerable. For Ethan, the walls he had so carefully built began to crumble. His usual control, the barrier he had always kept around his heart, shattered in the presence of Mia's gaze. He had never allowed himself to feel this exposed, this raw, but with her it was impossible to hold back. His body moved toward her without thought, his hands reaching out almost instinctively, as if his heart knew something his mind hadn't yet fully grasped. Mia too felt the pull. She had been trying to fight it, had been telling herself that falling for someone like Ethan was dangerous, that it would only lead to heartbreak. But in this moment, she realized that all of her defenses had melted away. She had no more excuses, no more justifications for holding back. What was happening between them couldn't be explained. It couldn't be rationalized. And then, as if drawn by the same invisible force, they were closer, their bodies almost touching. Ethan's breath was shallow, his chest tightening as he reached for her, cupping her face gently in his hands. There was no hesitation in her eyes, no retreat from his touch. She was there with him, in this moment of vulnerability, just as open and exposed as he was. "Mia!" Ethan's voice was a whisper, ragged with emotion. He hadn't intended to say anything, but her name slipped from his lips, soft and trembling, like a prayer he didn't know he needed. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Instead, she closed the distance between them, her hand reaching up to rest lightly on his chest, just above his heart. And in that quiet, breathless second, as the world outside seemed to disappear, they both knew what was about to happen. The tension, the yearning, the raw, undeniable connection they had shared, it all culminated in that one fragile moment. Their lips met softly, almost tentative at first, as though they were both testing the waters. Ethan's hands trembled slightly, though he tried to keep them steady, wanting to touch her, to pull her closer. But Mia, her fingers tracing the sharp outline of his jaw, deepened the kiss, drawing him in with a quiet urgency. It was no longer tentative, it was all-encompassing. Their lips moved together, slow and deliberate, the kiss full of tenderness and longing, but also something more, something deeper, more fragile. Ethan felt his entire world shift in that instant. It wasn't just desire, it wasn't just the pull of the physical attraction that had been growing between them for weeks. This was something that tore through him, something that left him breathless and exposed. For the first time in his life, he felt completely undone. The walls he had built, the empire he had created around himself, the control he had always held, everything was gone. There was only Mia now, her touch, her kiss, her presence. It was as if the very ground beneath him had fallen away, leaving him floating in the overwhelming sensation of being alive, truly alive, for the first time in years. And in that moment, as he held her close, he knew something irrevocable had changed. He wasn't the same man who had walked into this room minutes ago. Mia too felt the shift. As she pressed closer to him, her hands exploring the firm, warm expanse of his chest, she felt a flutter of excitement, mixed with something far more dangerous. She was falling for him, more deeply than she had ever allowed herself to believe. And she knew, even as her heart raced and her breath quickened, that this was a path she could never return from. Ethan was dangerous, yes, but more than that, he was the only person who had ever made her feel truly seen, truly alive. In the deepening kiss, Mia knew she was giving herself to him in a way she had never given herself to anyone. She had fought against this, had tried to convince herself that it was a mistake, that it was too risky. But now, with every heartbeat, she realized that she couldn't stop it. And yet somewhere in the back of her mind a warning flickered. She was falling for someone she shouldn't, someone whose world was built on power, control, and manipulation. But the pull was too strong, and as she let go, allowing herself to fully surrender to him, she knew that once this kiss ended, nothing would ever be the same again. When they finally pulled apart, it wasn't because they wanted to. It was because they had to, both gasping for air, both shaken by the intensity of the moment. Ethan's forehead rested against hers, his hands still holding her, unwilling to let go. Neither spoke for a long moment, simply catching their breath, feeling the rawness of what had just passed between them. But in the silence, as their hearts beat in time with one another, they both understood something. This wasn't just about the kiss. This was the beginning of something far more powerful, far more complicated. And though neither of them had the answers, one thing was clear. They were both in this together now, and neither of them was ready to turn away. The storm had been building for hours, a tempest that shook the windows and rattled the old timbers of the mansion. The rain poured down in sheets, lashing against the glass, creating a rhythmic, almost hypnotic sound. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low growl that seemed to echo the tension in the air. The wind howled as it swept across the estate, bending the trees in the garden and sending the branches swaying in a dance of nature's fury. Inside the mansion, however, there was an unusual stillness. The large, opulent rooms were quiet, almost too quiet. The usual hum of servants and staff was absent, the house deserted except for Ethan and Mia. It was a silence that seemed to heighten every sound, every movement, until the very air between them was thick with anticipation. In the grand living room, the only source of warmth and light came from the fire crackling in the fireplace, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. The flames danced and twisted, illuminating the rich wood paneling and plush furniture with a golden glow. But it was the space between Ethan and Mia that felt charged with energy. In the quiet of the storm, they were drawn together by forces neither could explain. Ethan sat in an armchair, his gaze fixed on the fire, though his thoughts were far from the dancing flames. His mind was consumed with the memory of their kiss, of the way her body had pressed against his, the heat of her touch, the softness of her lips. It had been a moment that had shaken him to his core, a vulnerability he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. And now, as he sat in the dim light, he could still feel the lingering trace of her touch, the echo of her presence in the room. He hadn't expected to be here, hadn't expected to find himself in this position. Mia had changed everything. The walls he had so carefully built, the fortress of control he had spent his entire life constructing, had crumbled at the mere touch of her. He could no longer pretend he was indifferent. He couldn't ignore the pull that had grown between them, the way every glance, every conversation, seemed to strip away a little more of the armor he had built around his heart. And then she appeared, walking into the room with a softness that seemed to contradict the storm outside. Mia, wrapped in a thick knitted blanket, her hair still damp from the rain, moved silently across the room. The simple sight of her took Ethan's breath away. She was like a vision, graceful, calm, and yet somehow untouchable. Her presence in that moment felt like the eye of the storm, quiet, still, but with an undercurrent of energy that seemed to pulse between them. She walked towards him slowly, as if unaware of the way her every step seemed to pull him closer. Her eyes met his, and for a moment there was nothing else. No storm, no mansion, no past. Just the two of them, suspended in that moment of perfect stillness. "Mia," Ethan breathed, his voice low, rough from the tension that had been building between them. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood there, looking at him, her eyes filled with something deeper than words could express. Her gaze was steady, not demanding, but rather inviting, as though she were giving him the space to come to her on his own terms. The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken emotions. The fire crackled in the background, its warmth providing the only sound in the room. Ethan's heart raced as he watched her, his mind overwhelmed with the weight of his own desire. He had never felt this way before, so raw, so vulnerable. With every passing second, it became harder to pretend that he wasn't completely drawn to her, completely undone by the way she made him feel. Mia took a step closer, and then another, until she was standing in front of him. She looked down at him, her hands gently clutching the blanket around her shoulders. The closeness between them seemed to intensify the already palpable tension, the air charged with something electric. Without a word, Ethan stood up, towering over her, his hand reaching out almost instinctively. He cupped her face in his palm, his thumb brushing lightly over her cheek. The touch was gentle, tender, but it carried with it a weight of longing that neither of them could deny. Mia's breath caught at the touch, her heart pounding in her chest. She had felt it before, the pull between them, the way her body responded to his without question. But this time, it was different. There was a vulnerability in the air, a quiet honesty that made the moment feel like something far more significant than any fleeting attraction. It was as if the storm outside had been a reflection of the turmoil inside them both, a storm that was now beginning to quiet, to give way to something else. Their eyes locked, and for a moment, neither of them moved. It was as though the world had paused, waiting for them to make the choice. Ethan could feel the weight of her gaze, the way she held him in her presence, as though she were the only one who could see him, truly see him. Then, without thinking, he leaned forward, closing the distance between them. His lips brushed against hers, tentative at first, as though he were waiting for her to pull away, waiting for some sign that she didn't feel the same pull. But when she didn't, when she leaned into him, the kiss deepened. It was slow, but it wasn't without urgency. It was a kiss that spoke of something more than just desire. It was a kiss that spoke of surrender, of trust, of the quiet promise of what was to come. Mia's hands moved up to his chest, feeling the solid warmth of his body through the fabric of his shirt. She had always known that Ethan was dangerous, his power, his control, his world. But in that moment, none of it mattered. There was only the way he made her feel, the way his touch sent waves of heat through her body, making her forget everything but the way they fit together. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a union, an unspoken bond that formed between them in the warmth of the fire and the storm outside. It was an exchange of vulnerability, a fusion of two souls who had been yearning for something neither of them could fully understand. When they finally pulled away, their breaths were shallow, their bodies still pressed together, as though neither wanted to break the connection. Mia's chest rose and fell with every breath, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. There was nothing that needed to be said. The kiss had told them everything they needed to know. Ethan brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, his touch lingering just a moment longer than necessary. "I don't want this to end," he whispered, his voice hushed, raw. Mia's lips curved into a soft smile, her eyes soft and full of understanding. "It doesn't have to," she replied, her voice a quiet promise. And in that moment, they both knew that the storm had passed. What had started as a tempest had now turned into something more, a beginning, not an end. Something that neither of them could resist, no matter how hard they tried. The morning after the storm had passed, the mansion seemed quieter than ever. The rain had stopped, and though the sun had not yet fully risen, the sky held the promise of a new day. But within the walls of Ethan's estate, nothing was the same. The transformation wasn't immediate, but the change was undeniable. A subtle shift had occurred overnight, one that neither Ethan nor Mia could ignore. They had crossed a threshold, one that had bound them together in ways neither had anticipated. Ethan, the man who had spent years building his empire, who had spent most of his life closed off from the world, was different. There was something in the way he moved, in the way he held himself, that spoke of a quiet awakening. It wasn't a dramatic change. It was more like the first rays of light filtering through the fog after a storm. It was gentle, slow, but it was there. He found himself in the kitchen that morning, standing by the counter, a cup of coffee in his hand. He didn't know why he was there, or why he had felt the need to come down early to sit quietly before the day began. But as he looked out the window, watching the sun rise over the grounds, he realized that the mansion felt different. It was no longer just a place to hide away from the world. It was a space he was beginning to share with someone else. As he took a sip of his coffee, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. He turned to see Mia, her hair still damp from the shower, her presence as calm and steady as ever. She didn't speak immediately, but there was a softness in her eyes, a kind of gentleness that had begun to form between them. "Good morning," she said, her voice low and steady. "Morning," Ethan replied, offering her a small smile. It was the first real smile he had given in a long time, and for a moment he couldn't quite believe it had come so easily. Mia walked over to the counter, pouring herself a cup of coffee. She didn't sit down right away, instead choosing to stand beside him, the silence between them no longer uncomfortable. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, something that had been forged in the quiet of the night, in the tenderness of their shared kiss. They didn't need to fill the silence with words. It was enough to simply be there, together, in the same space, in the same moment. Ethan was starting to realize that he didn't need to fill the emptiness inside him with power, with control, or with the emptiness of his old lifestyle. There was something else, something simpler, that had begun to take its place. As the days went by, Ethan continued to change, though the transformation was not immediate or dramatic. It was a subtle shift, one that happened little by little, like the slow unfolding of a flower in spring. He began to take more interest in the small details of life, things that had once seemed insignificant to him. He started to join the staff at meals, no longer retreating to his study or eating alone in the grand dining room. He began to call his employees by their names, acknowledging them in ways he had never done before. And though it seemed like a small change, it was huge for Ethan, who had spent his entire life in isolation. Disconnected from the people around him, Mia too was changing. She had always been strong, always been independent, but something about Ethan had cracked open a part of her that she had long kept hidden. She had resisted allowing herself to feel, to open her heart to someone who had the power to hurt her. But with Ethan, it felt different. She didn't feel like she had to protect herself, to hide behind walls. She was beginning to allow herself to experience the connection between them, to let the tenderness of their moments together seep into her heart. She caught herself smiling more often, when he looked at her, when he spoke to her, when they shared a simple meal together. They had stopped being just two people sharing a physical space. They had become something more. Two souls who had found each other in a world that seemed intent on keeping them apart. Their relationship, which had begun with a kiss, had evolved into something far more complex. It was no longer just about desire or attraction. It was about connection. It was in the quiet moments they shared, the mornings when they sat together in the kitchen, drinking coffee, their hands brushing as they reached for the same cup, the evenings when they went for long walks around the estate, the air fresh and cool after the rain, the sound of their footsteps in sync with the rhythm of their hearts. It was in the way they looked at each other, silently acknowledging the depth of what they had begun to build. They were no longer just two people caught in the storm of passion. They were building something that felt more real, more enduring. It was as if they had been given a second chance, not just at love, but at life. Ethan, once a man who had hidden behind walls of wealth and power, was learning to live without those walls. And Mia, who had always kept a part of herself guarded, was beginning to trust again. One evening, after dinner, they went for a walk through the garden. The air was still damp from the earlier rain, and the scent of earth and flowers filled the air. They walked side by side, neither of them speaking, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with a quiet understanding, a peace that had begun to settle between them. "Do you think things will ever be normal again?" Mia asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. Ethan glanced at her, his heart heavy with the weight of her question. "I don't know," he replied, his voice low. "But maybe normal isn't what we need. Maybe we need something more real, something that can hold us when everything else falls apart." Mia looked up at him then, her gaze soft and thoughtful. "I think I'm starting to understand that," she said quietly. And in that moment, as they stood in the quiet of the garden, with the storm of their pasts behind them and the future uncertain, they both knew that whatever came next, they had already begun to build something worth fighting for. The love they were creating wasn't perfect. It wasn't without its complications, its challenges, its fears, but it was real. And that, for both of them, was enough. The evening had been peaceful. Ethan and Mia had spent the day together, their connection deepening with each passing moment. They shared laughter, stolen glances, and gentle touches that spoke more than words ever could. The warmth between them felt like a haven, a place where nothing could touch them, where the world outside with all its chaos and demands could no longer intrude. But peace, as it often does, proved to be fleeting. Ethan had invited Mia to join him for dinner in the grand dining room, a quiet affair with just the two of them. The mansion was calm, the staff having retired for the evening, leaving the two of them alone in the flickering candlelight. The evening had felt intimate, like a shared secret between them, the kind that wrapped itself around the heart and made everything else seem irrelevant. But as they shared their dessert, talking quietly, a knock on the door interrupted the moment. Ethan looked up, his brow furrowing at the unexpected disturbance. Before he could say anything, the door opened, and in walked a woman whose presence seemed to fill the entire room with a chilling weight. Harper. Mia's heart skipped a beat when she saw her. The woman was breathtaking, elegant, poised, and undeniably beautiful, with a dangerous edge that made the room feel suddenly colder. Her eyes scanned the room, settling on Ethan with a look that suggested familiarity, but there was something in her gaze that immediately set Mia on edge. She was his ex-wife, the woman from his past, the woman who still seemed to hold a place in his life, even though the marriage had ended long ago. Ethan stood up, his face hardening when he saw her. "Harper," he said, his voice guarded. "What are you doing here?" Harper smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was cold, calculating, the smile of someone who knew how to get what she wanted. "I came to see how you were, of course," she said, her voice dripping with honey, but her eyes never left Mia. "I wasn't sure if you were still in town, but I thought I'd drop by. It's been too long, hasn't it?" Ethan's gaze narrowed, his body tense, but before he could respond, Harper turned to Mia, her smile shifting into something sharper, more venomous. Mia felt her stomach tighten, a knot of unease forming in the pit of her belly. There was something in the way Harper looked at her, something that felt like an assessment, a challenge, as if she were trying to decide just how much of a threat Mia really was. "You must be Mia," Harper said, her voice dripping with condescension. "How quaint. A housekeeper, I presume?" Mia's breath caught in her throat, but she refused to let the woman see the effect her words had on her. She squared her shoulders, meeting Harper's gaze with a calmness she didn't quite feel. She had dealt with people like Harper before, women who tried to belittle her, to make her feel small. But this was different. This wasn't just anyone. This was Ethan's past. "Actually, I'm more than that," Mia replied, her voice steady, though she could feel the heat rising in her chest. "I'm someone who matters, and if you have a problem with that, you can take it up with him." Harper's lips curled into a smile, but there was nothing pleasant about it. "I see," she said slowly, her gaze sweeping over Mia in a way that made Mia feel exposed, as if she were being judged for something she couldn't control. "You think you matter, do you?" Mia's heart began to pound in her chest, the taunt in Harper's voice like a slap across her face. But what came next was worse than anything Mia could have imagined. Harper's voice lowered, almost a whisper, but it was laced with cruelty that cut through the room like a knife. "You really think someone like him would ever love someone like you?" Harper's words were cold and deliberate, each one hitting its mark with precision. "Ethan doesn't love anyone. He never did, not even with me, and he certainly doesn't love you. You're just temporary, a distraction." Mia froze, her breath hitching in her throat. The words, though cruel, struck a nerve she hadn't expected. For the first time in a long time, self-doubt crept into her mind. Was she just a distraction? Was she nothing more than a fleeting moment in Ethan's life, something he could simply cast aside when it no longer suited him? The room felt like it was closing in on her, the air thick with tension, with a weight she couldn't shake. She had fought so hard to protect her heart, to keep herself from getting lost in the dangerous emotions that Ethan stirred in her. But now, hearing those words from Harper, it all felt so fragile, so easily destroyed. Ethan's eyes flashed with fury, his body tensing as if he were about to strike. But before he could speak, Mia stepped forward, her voice steady, though her hands were trembling. "That's enough," she said, her words sharp and firm. "I don't need your approval, Harper. I don't need your validation." She turned to Ethan, her gaze unwavering, though she could feel the sting of Harper's words still lingering in her chest. If he wants me, he'll choose me. But if he's still holding on to the past, then maybe it's time for me to walk away. Ethan's face softened, the anger fading into something else, something he couldn't hide, something he hadn't wanted to feel. But before he could say anything, Mia turned and walked toward the door, her heart heavy with uncertainty. She couldn't stay here, not with Harper's cruel words echoing in her mind. "Mia!" Ethan called, his voice tight with emotion. But Mia didn't stop. She couldn't. Not now. Harper's triumphant smile was like a knife in her back, and Mia couldn't bear the thought of being in the same room with her for another moment. The wound Harper had inflicted was deep, and even though Ethan tried to defend her, it was already done. The emotional damage had been done. When Mia reached the door, Ethan finally moved. He crossed the room in a few long strides and grabbed her arm, stopping her before she could escape. "Don't," he said, his voice rough. "Don't let her get to you. She's trying to tear us apart, but I won't let her. Mia, listen to me." But Mia shook her head, pulling away from his grip. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the regret, but it wasn't enough. The damage was done, and the doubts were already creeping into her heart. "I need time, Ethan. I need to figure out if I'm just your distraction or if I really matter to you, because right now I don't know." And with that, she walked away, the weight of Harper's words pressing on her shoulders. Ethan stood there watching her go, feeling powerless for the first time in years. Harper had struck where it hurt the most, at the very core of what he had been trying to build with Mia. But this wasn't over. Not yet. The sound of the phone ringing in the dead of night jolted Ethan from his sleep. His mind was still foggy with sleep, and for a moment he didn't know whether it was the storm outside or the ringing that had woken him. But when he looked at the clock, he saw that it was nearly 3 a.m. A sense of unease crept up his spine as he reached for the phone on his bedside table, his fingers trembling slightly as he answered. "Ethan," the voice on the other end of the line said, urgent, strained. It's about your father. He's in the hospital. He's not doing well." Ethan's heart skipped a beat and he sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. "What happened? Is he okay?" "They don't know yet. It's serious, Ethan. You need to come. They're saying it's a matter of time." His father, Robert Caldwell, wasn't just a man in Ethan's life. He was the patriarch of the Caldwell Empire, the man who had built the foundations of the business that had made Ethan who he was today. Their relationship had always been complicated, distant at times, but hearing the urgency in the voice of the hospital's head doctor sent a wave of dread through Ethan's chest. Without hesitation, he threw on his clothes and rushed out the door, the weight of the news pulling at his every step. The drive to the hospital felt like it took hours, though in reality it was no more than 20 minutes. But the anticipation gnawed at him, and by the time he entered the sterile, quiet hallways of the hospital, he could feel the heaviness of what was to come. He made his way to his father's room, his thoughts racing as the hospital's fluorescent lights flickered above him. As he approached the door, the doctor came out to meet him, his face grim. "Your father is stable for now," the doctor said, trying to offer some form of reassurance. "But we're running out of time. We need to discuss his affairs." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. He didn't want to think about his father's legacy just yet, not while he was still alive, fighting for his breath. But he followed the doctor into the room, where his father lay in a sterile hospital bed, connected to machines that beeped steadily in the background. Robert Caldwell was still a formidable figure, even in his weakened state. His once strong frame was now frail, his face pale and drawn. He opened his eyes when Ethan entered, a faint, strained smile pulling at his lips. "Son." His voice was rough, barely a whisper. "Dad," Ethan replied, his voice thick with emotion. "What happened? How bad is it?" Robert coughed softly, his chest rattling with the effort. "It's bad, Ethan. I'm not going to make it. But I need to tell you something. Something that's been hidden for a long time." Ethan's heart clenched in his chest, and he leaned forward, his eyes wide with confusion. "What is it, Dad? What's going on?" Robert's eyes flickered with something, guilt maybe. He coughed again, and then he reached for the bedside table. With trembling hands, he pulled out an envelope and handed it to Ethan. "Your mother. She wasn't the only one I was involved with," Robert whispered. There was another woman, Lucille. She worked for us. And I had a child with her. Ethan froze, his fingers gripping the envelope so tightly that it threatened to tear. What are you talking about? His voice was barely a whisper, disbelief flooding his chest. The weight of the words hung in the air, and as Ethan opened the envelope, his heart seemed to stop. The letter inside was short, written in a hurried, scrawled hand. Ethan, your father had a child with Lucille, one of his employees. The child is a girl. We have reason to believe that she is living in your household. You need to investigate this before it's too late. The letter felt like a punch to the gut. His mind raced, but the one thought that cut through the chaos was clear. Mia. His mind flashed back to everything he had learned about her, the way she had spoken of her mother, Lucille. Could she be his half-sister? A cold, sinking feeling took root in Ethan's stomach. He couldn't breathe as the realization hit him. The woman he had come to love, the woman who had so completely transformed his world, was she connected to his father in a way that made everything between them impossible? His hands shook as he dropped the letter, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed answers. He needed to know the truth. Without saying another word to the doctor, Ethan rushed out of the room and toward the mansion, his mind spinning. His father's revelation was like a dark cloud descending on everything he had come to hold dear. Mia, his love for her, the life they had started to build together. Was it all a lie? Could he even trust anything now? When he arrived at the mansion, he found Mia in the library, the soft glow of a desk lamp illuminating her face. She looked up when he entered, her face softening as she saw him. Ethan? Her voice was calm, but there was a worry in her eyes as she stood to approach him. Mia, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He couldn't hold it back any longer. I need to ask you something. Your mother, Lucille, was she ever connected to my father? Did she have a child with him? Mia's face went pale, and she took a step back, her hand instinctively going to her chest. What are you talking about? I need to know, Mia. Please, Ethan begged, his heart racing. Was your mother involved with my father? Were you his daughter? Mia took a step back, her eyes filling with tears. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, Ethan. I don't know who he is. I don't know anything about your father. I never met him. Ethan stood there, frozen. The air between them seemed to stretch, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. The emotional toll of his father's confession was too much for either of them to bear in that moment. The truth they had been building together was now fractured. The bond between them, the love they had shared, suddenly felt tainted by the shadow of a possible incestuous connection. Ethan stepped back, his heart sinking as his mind reeled. And Mia? She stood motionless, the words of her mother's silence echoing in her mind. Could she have been tied to his family in a way that made everything between them impossible? Neither of them had the answers. And for the first time, their love seemed to shatter, lost in the shadows of secrets that neither of them could escape. The days following their confrontation were long and silent. The mansion, once full of the soft hum of their shared moments, had become eerily quiet. The echoes of laughter, the gentle sounds of conversation, the warmth of their shared space, all of it seemed to have vanished, leaving only cold, hollow spaces behind. Every room in the house felt empty, without the connection they had once shared, as though the walls themselves were mourning the loss of something precious. Mia had retreated into herself, her presence still there, but distant. She avoided Ethan's gaze whenever they crossed paths, her eyes downcast, her movements swift, as though she couldn't bear to be in his presence without feeling the weight of the truth that had torn them apart. The revelations about her mother and the haunting possibility that they could be half-siblings had shattered everything. Mia's heart ached with the confusion of it all. She loved him, she knew that now more than ever. But could she continue to love him when their very foundation had crumbled beneath them? For the first time, she felt like a stranger in her own world. The house that had once felt like a safe haven now felt like a prison, each corner reminding her of what they had once shared and what now seemed impossible. Ethan, for his part, was a man on a mission. He could not, would not, accept what had happened between them. The possibility that Mia could be his half-sister weighed heavily on him, but he refused to believe it. He refused to believe that the love they had shared, the bond they had formed, could be tainted by something so ugly. He would fight for her, for them, even if it meant uncovering painful truths about his family, about his father, and about himself. He called lawyers, arranged for DNA tests, and spent countless hours buried in documents. Each day, he became more determined to find the truth, to prove that Mia was not what his father's letter had suggested. He didn't care how long it took. He would go to any lengths to make things right. He needed answers, not just for himself, but for Mia. He couldn't lose her, not when he had finally found something real, something worth holding on to. But even as he fought, the house around him seemed to echo his desperation. The grand rooms, the lavish furniture, the marble floors, they all felt colder now, less inviting. It was as if the mansion itself had lost its warmth in the absence of the love that had once filled it. Ethan could feel it every time he passed through the corridors, every time he walked into a room that Mia had once brightened with her presence. Now, everything felt distant, as though the very air had become heavier, more oppressive. His thoughts were consumed by the woman he loved. The pain of not knowing what had truly happened between them, the uncertainty of the situation, was almost unbearable. Ethan had always been in control, always the one who held power over his world. But now he felt as though he were drowning, caught in a storm he couldn't navigate, with no way to find the shore. Despite his efforts to reach out to Mia, to talk to her, she remained distant. She had put up walls that Ethan couldn't break through. Each attempt to reconnect was met with silence. Mia didn't want to hear him. She couldn't bear the thought of facing him when there was still doubt lingering in the air, when their entire relationship had been called into question. Mia's heart ached every time she saw Ethan, every time their paths crossed in the mansion. She missed him. Her heart screamed for him, but there was too much uncertainty, too much fear. She had to protect herself, no matter how much it hurt. The question of whether they were truly meant to be, whether they could ever be together without the shadow of incest hanging over them, was too much to bear. The love she felt for him was pure, real, and deep. But could she continue to love him in the face of all that had happened? Could she continue to trust him when the very foundation of their relationship had been built on lies? The truth about her mother, about the possibility of their blood connection, twisted the knife in her chest. The thought that their love could be tainted by something so terrible was almost too much to bear. Every day felt like a battle. She spent her time in the mansion in a fog, moving through the motions of daily life, but feeling utterly disconnected from everything around her. Her heart ached for Ethan, but her mind told her to stay away. She couldn't let herself be consumed by the love she felt for him, not when there was still so much doubt. Mia would sit by the window in the library, watching the rain fall in steady sheets, feeling the cold air against her skin. The isolation felt like a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. She longed for the warmth of Ethan's arms around her, for the quiet moments they had shared when everything had seemed so simple. But now, nothing was simple. Nothing was clear. As the days passed, the weight of the silence between them grew heavier. The house that had once been a sanctuary now felt like a tomb. Ethan was trying to fix things, trying to find the answers, but Mia didn't know if the answers would be enough. Could the love they had shared survive in the face of such an unimaginable revelation? Mia knew that she couldn't keep running from the truth forever. She loved Ethan more than she had ever loved anyone, and the thought of walking away from him was unbearable. But how could she stay when she wasn't sure of the future? How could she trust that their love was real when the foundation of it had been shattered by something neither of them could control? Ethan's heart was breaking as he searched for the truth. He had never felt so helpless, so out of control. He couldn't understand why Mia was pushing him away, why she couldn't see that he was fighting for her. Didn't she know how much he loved her? Didn't she understand that he would do anything to prove to her that they were meant to be? But the truth was, Mia didn't know if they were meant to be anymore. And that uncertainty, that doubt, was enough to tear her apart. The mansion, cold and silent, stood as a symbol of the fracture that had split them apart. What had once been a place of warmth, of connection, now felt empty, just like the space between Ethan and Mia. The love that had grown so quickly between them now felt like a distant memory, something they had both lost in the face of a truth neither of them could escape. As the days went by, Mia knew she had to make a choice. Could she fight for the love they had built, or would she walk away, unable to bear the weight of the uncertainty that now hung over them? The pain of the separation was unbearable, but Mia knew one thing for sure: she couldn't keep living in limbo. She had to make a decision, no matter how much it hurt. The truth had always felt like an elusive thing for Ethan, something that hovered just beyond his reach, teasing him with its mysteries, hiding in the shadows of his life. But in that moment, as he sat across from his lawyer, the answer was clear, undeniable. The letter his father had sent, the one that had driven a wedge between him and Mia, had been nothing more than a lie. The lawyer's words were firm, each one cutting through the chaos in Ethan's mind. The claim about Lucille and the child, it's false, Ethan. Lucille had a son, yes, but not with your father. The documents were forged. Someone tried to use your father's past to tear you apart. For a moment, Ethan could hardly breathe. His entire world had shifted in an instant. His heart pounded in his chest, the relief that rushed through him like a flood, though it was tainted with the sting of the lies that had almost cost him everything. His mind raced, the truth settling into his bones with a weight that was both a relief and a new kind of heartbreak. It had been a cruel trick, an attempt to destroy something real, something pure, and Ethan couldn't help but feel betrayed by the person who had orchestrated it. The man who had set this plan into motion, the one who had hurt Mia and manipulated him into believing the worst. His father's legacy was now tainted by the damage his actions had caused. But despite the anger, despite the betrayal, one truth remained clear. Mia was not his half-sister. They were free to love each other without the shadow of incest hanging over them. Ethan stood abruptly, his heart racing as the news sank in. His eyes blurred with unshed tears, but the relief was overpowering. He had to find Mia, he had to tell her. Without thinking, he rushed through the mansion, his feet pounding against the cold floors, his mind consumed with the need to see her, to hold her. He had spent so many days in agony, tortured by the thought that their love might be forbidden, that their bond could never be. But now there was nothing standing in their way. The hallway seemed endless, the distance between them far too great. He could feel his heart hammering in his chest as though it were trying to catch up to him. The walls of the mansion, once filled with tension and silence, now felt alive with the promise of something new, something beautiful. When he finally reached the library, he saw her, Mia, standing by the window, her back to him. She was looking out at the darkening sky, her hands clasped in front of her, her posture a silent expression of the uncertainty that had gripped her for so long. "Mia," Ethan called, his voice breaking through the silence. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his. And in that moment, everything fell into place. The pain, the distance, the uncertainty, it all seemed to dissipate, leaving only the truth that they were meant to be together. "Mia, I know the truth now," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "It wasn't what we thought. The letter from my father, it was a lie. You're not my half-sister. We're not related. We can be together. We can—" Mia's eyes widened, a mixture of disbelief and relief washing over her face. For a moment she didn't speak, her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to process the words he was saying. She had been so consumed by the doubt, the fear, the shame of the past days. But now, hearing him say the words, the truth, it was like a weight lifting off her shoulders. She stepped forward, her arms trembling as she reached for him. Without a word, she pulled him into an embrace, her body pressing against his, as though she couldn't bear to let go. Ethan's arms wrapped around her, pulling her close, his heart aching with the intensity of the moment. "Mia," he whispered into her hair, his voice breaking. "I thought I lost you. I couldn't bear the thought of it. But we're free now, free to love each other, free to be together. You're not my sister, you're the woman I love, and I'll never let you go." Mia's tears soaked into his shirt as she held him tighter, her heart overwhelmed with the rush of emotion. She had spent so many nights alone, wondering if their love was doomed, if they were nothing more than a tragic mistake. But now, all of that faded into the background. She was with him, and that was all that mattered. "I love you, Ethan," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "I never wanted to leave you. I was just so scared. I didn't know what to believe anymore." Ethan pulled back slightly, his hands framing her face as he looked into her eyes, searching for any trace of doubt. But there was none. Only love. Only the raw, unfiltered truth that had always been there, waiting for them to find it. "Mia," he said softly, his voice full of wonder, "we are nothing but two souls, free to love each other. And nothing will ever take that away from us." The moment hung between them, filled with the promise of everything they had longed for. Ethan leaned in slowly, his lips brushing against hers with a tenderness that spoke volumes. The kiss was gentle at first, but as the truth of their words settled in, it deepened, the connection between them stronger than ever before. The world outside the mansion, the secrets, the pain, it all faded away as they gave in to the passion that had been building between them for so long. When they finally pulled away, their breaths ragged, their faces flushed with the intensity of their emotions, Ethan smiled through his tears. "We're free, Mia," he whispered, "and I'll spend the rest of my life making up for the time we lost." Mia smiled through her own tears, her heart overflowing with love for him. "And I'll spend the rest of my life with you," she replied softly. Together they stood in the quiet of the library, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the truth of their love. The world outside was uncertain, but inside they had found their peace. They were no longer bound by lies, no longer trapped by the past. They were free to build their future, together. As they kissed again, the warmth of their love enveloping them, the rest of the world seemed to disappear. And for the first time in their lives, they both knew that everything had finally fallen into place. The days that followed the revelation, the healing, and the reconnection between Mia and Ethan were like a rebirth. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and control, now felt like a home, a place of peace, of love, a place where both of them could finally be free from the shadows of their pasts. It wasn't just the walls of the house that had changed, but the lives of the two people living within them. Ethan, driven by a newfound sense of clarity, began to make sweeping changes. He sold off the companies that had once been his pride and joy, the very foundations of the empire he had built. But none of it mattered anymore. The power, the wealth, the control, these things had never fulfilled him, never brought him the joy he had always been seeking. What he realized, now more than ever, was that the only thing that truly mattered was the love he shared with Mia. He let go of the excesses, the luxury cars, the massive impersonal homes, the unneeded trappings of success that had defined him for so long. With every step, he shed the weight of his old life, replacing it with something far more meaningful: simplicity, authenticity, and most importantly, Mia. Ethan's transformation wasn't just about material things, it was about the soul. His soul, which had been hardened and locked away for so long, had finally been unlocked. Mia had taught him that love wasn't about dominance or control, it wasn't about building a fortress around your heart. Love was about connection, vulnerability, and trust. It was about living in the moment and allowing yourself to be seen, without fear of rejection or judgment. Mia, too, had changed in subtle but powerful ways. She remained the same woman who had captured his heart from the very beginning, strong, simple, and authentic. But now, there was a quiet peace in her eyes, a calmness in her spirit that had once been absent. Ethan had helped her heal the wounds she had carried for so long, the scars from a life that had taught her to protect herself, to hold back. But now, with him by her side, Mia had learned to let go of her fears. She had learned to trust again, not just in Ethan, but in herself. And now, with an engagement ring on her finger and peace in her heart, Mia knew that her life had become something she never thought possible. She had once believed that love was a fragile thing, something that could easily break. But now, with Ethan, she understood that love was built through the quiet moments, the shared breakfasts in the morning, the simple walks in the garden, the laughter they shared, and even the silences. They didn't need grand gestures to know that they were everything to each other. What they had was built on a foundation of mutual respect, trust, and love. Each morning, Ethan would wake up early, always before Mia, to prepare their breakfast. He'd make their favorite coffee, freshly brewed, just the way Mia liked it. They would sit together at the table, eating quietly, savoring the time they had before the world outside intruded. The mornings were simple, but they were perfect. It was in these small everyday moments that they found the strength of their bond. There was no need for extravagance, no need for validation. Just the two of them, in the quiet of their home, sharing a life that felt real, that felt solid. The afternoons were often spent together, walking through the garden or curled up on the couch in the living room, listening to the rain tap against the windows. Mia had come to love the rainy afternoons, when the world seemed to slow down, and the noise of life outside became a distant hum. It was in these moments of stillness that they connected the most. No words were necessary, just the simple act of being together was enough. The silences between them were no longer uncomfortable. They no longer felt like empty spaces to be filled with words. Instead, the silences were filled with understanding, with the knowledge that they didn't need to speak to feel connected. They could simply exist together, content in the quiet peace they had found. Ethan's heart had been heavy for so long, burdened by the weight of his past mistakes and the expectations of others. But now, with Mia, he felt lighter. It wasn't just about the changes he had made, the money he had given up, or the companies he had sold. It was about the love they had built. It was about the way Mia had helped him see the world differently. Mia had taught him that love wasn't a battle to be won, but a journey to be shared. And now, standing beside her, he knew that everything he had ever wanted was right in front of him. He didn't need anything else. With her, he had everything. Their relationship wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But that was the beauty of it. They had built something together, piece by piece, through the trials and challenges they had faced. And now, with every day that passed, their love grew stronger, deeper, more profound. It wasn't about grand moments, but about the simple acts of love they shared every day. And at the end of it all, when everything had settled, when the world outside seemed to fade into the background, a voice echoed in Ethan's mind, one that he couldn't shake. A question that had been asked so many times before. Have you ever loved someone so much that you would face the world just to be with them? The answer was clear. Ethan had faced the world, and more, for Mia. And Mia, in turn, had faced the world for him. Their love wasn't something that had happened by chance. It wasn't something that had been easily found. It had been built. It had been forged in the fires of truth, trust, and vulnerability. And now, as they stood together, their love was something that would never be shaken, never be broken. It was a love that had been built from the ground up, step by step, and it was theirs to keep forever. The mansion, the rain, the quiet moments, they were all a reminder of what had been lost, what had been found, and what they had built together. Their love wasn't just something they had stumbled upon, it was something they had worked for, something they had chosen to build every single day. And as they stood side by side, hand in hand, Ethan knew that he would never have to face the world alone again. Because with Mia, he had found everything he had ever needed. And so, what begins as a love story transforms into something more, a journey of self-discovery and redemption. Ethan and Mia not only found each other, but they rebuilt themselves, each carrying the scars of a past that shaped them, yet now serving as the foundation for an immortal love. They learned that true love isn't something you find, but something you build, with patience, vulnerability, and the courage to face the unknown. And you? Have you ever loved someone so deeply that you would face the world just to be with them? If this story touched you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share where you're listening from in the comments. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing stories like this.